And now for today's program. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in Republican and Democratic administrations. He is the author of 5 books, including The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Aaron is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and BBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. Aaron is an advisory board member for Moment's own Moment Institute Middle East Fellows Program. Robin Wright is a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. She is one of the country's foremost authorities on the Middle East, Islamic extremism, Iran, and political and military dynamics in the Muslim world. A highly decorated journalist, Robin has reported from more than 140 countries. She is a longtime writer for The New Yorker, a former diplomatic correspondent for The Washington Post, and a fixture on primetime news programs. Robin was the recipient of the UN Correspondent's Gold Medal for International Reporting and the National Magazine Award for Reportage from Iran in The New Yorker. Robin has written or edited 8 books, including the widely acclaimed Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. Joining Aaron and Robin today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Robert is a special contributor to Moment magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Aaron David Miller, Robin Wright, and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you very much for that introduction. And Aaron Miller, it's always good to see you, and I'm glad to be seeing you once again. Welcome.
Great to see you, Robert. Wonderful to be with Robin.
And exactly, I'd like to turn to Robin, who is new to these Moment Zoom sessions. So, Robin, you've already written about what's happened in the conflict between Israel and Iran, which has been an escalation. First, the Israel strike in Syria at an Iranian diplomatic post where there were several military officers. And then, of course, the Iranian response and the Israeli defense against that response. You say we've seen a new escalation, but it's an escalation of a conflict that neither side can win. Is that right?
Absolutely. This is taking the war between Iran played out through its proxies against Israel out of the shadow war and into the open. It's a direct confrontation that endangers the whole region. The thing that concerns me a lot is that Israel has certainly been very effective in its strike on the Iranian diplomatic facility in Syria. It eliminated 3 generals who were responsible for covert operations in Syria and Lebanon. Israel has also proven in Iran's counterstrike that it has a deterrent capability. It has a far superior military, and it has strong allies in the United States, Britain, Jordan, and France. The question for me is whether Israel's strategy is short-term. Is it kind of gaming what Iran or its proxies may be doing against it and trying to preempt them by either military or cyber attacks? The question I have is, what is Israel seeking to achieve long term? Is it just to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear capability? Is it to try to foment conditions that lead to regime change? That's not clear. And I don't think Israel has a long-term strategy yet. I think Iran, on the other hand, is playing the long-term game. Since 1982, it has built an alliance of non-state actors, very powerful militias, well-armed, in many cases well-trained, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, forces that have disrupted international trade in the Red Sea, that have attacked Israel repeatedly. Hezbollah and Israel have engaged in 2 major wars. The reality, though, is that Iran's counterstrike was an utter and embarrassing failure. And the question is, what is it trying to do? It claims to try to defeat Israel and force U.S. forces out of the Middle East, but those are goals that are unrealistic and unattainable. And so I think we have two countries that are at odds with each other and have very different strategies, and neither may succeed in the short term.
Just one follow-up question before we turn to Aaron, which is there are two different views of how massive the Iranian massive attack was. That is, hundreds of missiles, including over 30 cruise missiles, were fired at Israel. But there was a sense, and there were many stories suggesting that perhaps Iran was making a measured response, almost to the extent of pulling punches and throwing less at Israel than we might have thought they would. Where do you come down on that question?
Well, the United States originally estimated that it'd be about a dozen ballistic missiles. And a U.S. official that I talked to described his hand shaking when CENTCOM gave him an early estimate as this was about to happen, that Iran was about to launch more than 100 missiles. So everyone was taken by surprise. But the reality is also that Iran has a far greater arsenal. It used less than 10% of what it has. So if Israel engages in some kind of retaliation or counterstrike, Iran could go at it again. Now, that would mean depleting some of its forces. If it asks its allies, particularly in Lebanon, to join in, that could deplete its forces. And, this is a question of how far is either country willing to go to counter the other.
Well, let's turn to Aaron David Miller. And let's first, Aaron, hear your lead on what happened over the past week or so.
First of all, it's great to be here again with you, Robert. And about Robin, I mean, she really is among the finest analysts, not just of Iran, but the region and U.S. policy as well. Look, with apologies to Clint Eastwood, my framing is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is clearly that the Israelis, with a layered defense Arrow 3 and a most sophisticated version of Iron Dome, with the support of the United States, Jordan actively and publicly downing pilotless drones, and the unannounced cooperation of the Middle East defense, air defense, the so-called MEAD, which involves Bahrain, the Emiratis, and even though the Saudis have denied it, they provided intelligence as well. So that's the good. A Bedouin girl in the Negev was severely wounded. Israelis stopped 99% of these missiles before they even entered Israeli airspace. So that's the good. And by the way, I don't think that there is any precedent for any Israeli military activity that involved the US, Britain, and France, plus key Arab states. That to me is unprecedented. And the fact that it occurred at a time when Arab publics are white hot angry about what's going on in Gaza is something to keep your eye on. So that's the good. The bad is that I agree with Robin. When you launch 350 pilotless drones, cruise, and ballistic missiles, there is absolutely no guarantee that Israel's layered defense would have stopped them all. So the reality is, had some of those gotten through, we really would have, I think, inexorably rushed to where I hope we're not going, which is a regional war. Iran created a new reality. Not since Saddam Hussein 33 years ago launched 43 Scuds at Israel has any state attacked Israel directly. Certainly not with missiles. So that's the bad. There are new rules here, and hopefully they'll be reestablished. The ugly, of course, is the real possibility. I would argue we're not going there, of something Middle East has never seen before, which is a regional war which involves major escalation with 150,000 high trajectory weapons on the part of Hezbollah, Israel's preemption or countering, which would involve massive destruction of Lebanese infrastructure. I think killing thousands of Lebanese, hundreds of Israelis would die in Hezbollah's air assault, and exchanges of ballistic missiles. I think Robin's right. The reality is that Iran does have a repository, probably attacks on oil interests in the Gulf. And under those circumstances, there is no way the U.S. could stay in the side. So that's the ugly. Whether or not we're going to get there, unclear. We're waiting for the next shoe to drop, probably after Passover.
You've mentioned the remarkable degree of cooperation that Israel found among the U.S., Britain, France, and its Middle Eastern allies. On the other hand, it seems that the U.S. didn't get a lot of advance notice on what Israel was going to do when it struck in Syria. I mean, how are things very close right now between the U.S. and Israel? Are they have the arguments over Gaza complicated dealings between the two militaries? What's happening?
Well, there's no question that U.S.-Israeli relations have grown more fraught. There's a tremendous degree of anger. And if you believe the New York Times TikTok on the Israeli strike, enormous anger on the part of the administration that they were given a heads up, but only belatedly on the strike against the whatever it was, the consulate of the embassy, Iranian embassy in Damascus. But Robert, again, I've been arguing this from the beginning. The Biden administration's view of Israel, its approach, its policies, what I term passive aggressive. We're 6 months, almost 7 months next month into this war, and you haven't seen a single action on the part of the United States that you and I, as normal humans, would regard as severe or consequential pressure. The three levers available to the U.S., restrict condition military assistance, haven't pulled that, at least the administration hasn't. Voting for a very critical UN Security Council resolution against the Israelis, you haven't seen that. You saw an abstention, which Linda Thomas Greenfield walked back almost immediately and claimed it was non-binding. And finally, what I think is the nuclear option, you haven't seen the United States say, look, to the Israelis, forget the Israeli-Hamas hostage deal. We're not going to get that. Here's what we need to do. We need a cessation of hostilities. And we need to trade all the hostages for Palestinian prisoners and a comprehensive ceasefire. And they haven't done that. So again, until I'm not from Missouri, I'm from Ohio, but it's the show me state. So when I see the administration apply real pressure, then I'll believe it.
Robin Wright, what do you think the United States, what should the U.S. response to the escalation in the region be?
Well, we're dealing with two very different countries. One we're closely allied with, and one we thought has been our nemesis for 45 years. When it comes to Iran, we have limited options. There are those who argue we should take one path in dealing with Iran's nuclear program, solve that, deal with that, and then turn to all the other issues we have on its support for terrorism, its interference in the region, its human rights abuses, and so forth. Then there's the extreme on the other side that says we have to deal with them all at the same time. Neither one has managed to, under Republican and Democratic administrations, has managed to get us to a point where we as a nation agree and where the Iranians are willing to cooperate. I mean, remember, we had a nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, and you had the world's 6 major powers involved in unity, even though it coincided with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and occupation of Crimea. Today, we're in a very different world where you see China and Russia now siding with Iran, and at the UN saying, look, Israel started this tit for tat operation by killing Iranian generals in Syria. So the United States has also tried, sanctions. And today, the President Biden imposed new sanctions on 600 entities and individuals in Iran associated with Iran's drone program. The Trump administration imposed 1,500 sanctions on Iran. And as we've seen in other parts of the world, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, sanctions take just a very long time to have impacts, decades, a half century, and we don't have that kind of luxury with Iran. When it comes to Israel, Aaron's identified absolutely, the three options we have. And, this is where we've seen in Israel a government under Prime Minister Netanyahu who does what he thinks is in Israel's interest, and allies be damned. The one thing when you look at the two countries we're dealing with, Israel has the most hardline government it's had since independence in 1948. Iran has the hardest line government it's had since the 1979 revolution. And the challenge is getting either government to change their positions about each other, or, in our dealings, when there's not likely to be a change in the kind of national view or the political view, diplomatic view from these capitals anytime soon, even if there's a change in leadership. This is where you have governments that are very hard-nosed in what they are willing to do and how far they're willing to go.
Does the remarkable lack of success of the Iranian missile strike on Israel, do you think that it would be received, apart from being an embarrassment to the Iranian military, perhaps? Does it pack any lesson that would lead an Iranian to think differently about what they should do next, or how they should regard their own nuclear program? Or is there some takeaway, do you think, for them from this development?
I do, but I also think one thing we have to be careful about is when you say un-Iranian, we're talking about a country where, the government has maybe 25-30% support from the population. The vast majority of Iranians don't like their government for a variety of reasons, whether it's personal freedom, economic hardships, or living in a pariah state in a country that has a very proud tradition dating back 5,000 years, including in its relationship with its Jewish population in the past. Now I've forgotten your question.
Well, for the leadership in Iran,
yes.
Apart from embarrassment at the failure to do much damage to Israel with all these missiles, is there some lesson that leads to about what we should be doing next, or how we should regard our nuclear program, or anything else?
Absolutely. I think Iran will learn lessons. Remember that a good number of its missiles actually failed to launch. I think Israel's estimate of 99% intercepted or shot down is inflated, and perhaps there was an estimate today that it was 84%. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes lower. But I do think we have reached a threshold, and the Iranian general in charge of nuclear security today said, in light of what's happened, Iran will review its nuclear strategy. I do believe that we've reached a point that Iran will move forward on its nuclear program as a deterrent, not that it's going to use it, but it feels that it's the only way to protect itself. A regime that is at a political threshold as well, in trouble at home, about to undergo a leadership change. And so I think we are probably on a trajectory that Iran will continue, perhaps at a faster pace, in its nuclear advances. It's gotten to the point that with its fuel cycle, it can make 2 to 3 weapons, but it also needs, for actually to use something or to have a viable nuclear program, it needs to have delivery systems, it needs to have a warhead, and it needs to be able to marry these different aspects. We're not there yet, but we are. I think that Iran is reconsidering its political stance, which was it wasn't going to make the bomb, it was just going to work on having the different components to make it. Now I suspect Iran will become the 10th nuclear power.
Aaron Miller, thoughts on what we might expect from Iran next?
Iran now is a nuclear weapons threshold state, right? It has all the elements, the knowledge, scientific knowledge, the fissile material, to actually manufacture a weapon. What remains to be decided is an active program to actually weaponize, to cross the threshold. I mean, it's hard to say. Look at what the Iranians have gotten out of just being a screwdriver's turn away from a nuclear weapon. I guess the question that the Iranians would have to ask themselves, and Robin rightly talks about deterrence. Everybody's talking about that these days, including the Israelis. They'd have to weigh very carefully. 5 American presidents, maybe five, have basically said that they are prepared to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And I think the Israeli risk threshold on this is a hell of a lot lower. So if in fact, and the IAEA, do we really know? And this is Grossi, the head of the IAEA, has said this recently.
This is the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Do we really know given the compartmented nature of this program, where the Iranians are, do they have a physics package? Have they miniaturized the warhead? Clearly, as Robin knows, and suggested, they have enough fissile material to quickly manufacture enough fissile material for several nuclear weapons. So that would be clearly the trigger point.
Yeah.
And the Israelis would have to preempt. And I suspect on that one, they would coordinate with the administration. So now we're talking about something that even goes beyond any potential regional confrontation, radiation leaks. I mean, it would be extraordinary. And I think we want to avoid that. How you do that, Robert, right now, I think Israel and Iran are in a strategic cul-de-sac, and I don't think there's a way out. Only manage it. You can manage it and maybe contain it, but you can't extricate yourselves from it.
I'm curious to hear from both of you about what lessons you think the Israelis might have come away with from this experience. One possibility is that they can do what they want to do, as they did in Syria, and the relationship with Iran is so important to the United States as a regional issue that Israel's allies will be there, no matter how annoyed they might be about what step Israel might have taken.
I just offer one thought on that. I think when we assess Israel's response and the Israeli attitude, and by the way, if the press reporting is correct, it was Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot who argued at the War Cabinet that the Israelis should not wait, that they need to respond immediately to make it unmistakably clear there's no indecision and a direct causality between what Iran has done and the Israeli response. I would only make one additional point. I don't think you can look at the Israeli response without considering what happened on October 7th. The deterrent capacity, the breakdown of Israeli intelligence, the failure to respond to the needs of their own citizens in the wake of Hamas's willful, indiscriminate killing spree, the burnings, the rapings, the taking of hostages, has created a huge problem. There are analysts who argue that part of the reason Iran felt it could launch is because of Israel's weakness. Now, I don't know whether that's right or not, but it was a big risk for Iran to take. So how the Israelis are going to respond, how they look at Iran going forward, is very much forged in the shadow of the ongoing trauma of October 7th.
Robin, what do you think about that? What do you think the Israeli takeaway is about their relations, both the hostile relations with Iran and their very close allied relations with the U.S. in this episode?
Well, Israel clearly has to feel reassured that the United States would stand up with it, and as well as we know at least one Arab country and possibly others played a role, whether it's in intelligence or shooting down some of Iran's assets. So this is a moment that there's a sense of confidence that there are others who will step in militarily. The United States shot down more than 80 drones, 6 ballistic missiles. That's, a quarter of the military actions. I mean, American warplanes up in the skies above Israel shooting this stuff down, U.S. air defense systems intercepting. This was a huge role by the United States.
Yeah.
But the question is U.S. support open-ended? And how far will it go? And the United States has made clear to Israel that it will not participate in any strike on Iran or any operation in response to what happened April 13th and 14th. So the question is, how does this play out? If Israel is not listening to the United States, the danger is that the U.S., may not be as enthusiastic down the road in doing all that Israel wants or needs. So this is a kind of delicate balancing act going forward.
But actually, what happened last week was a break with a truism for decades, which was Israel seeks the weapons from the United States and aid from the United States, but they're not asking for U.S. troops to come and put themselves on the line for Israel. Those were, as you say, those were U.S. planes in the air, and those were U.S. weapon systems being fired by U.S. servicemen and women.
I suspect the Pentagon would make a distinction there, that the U.S. has still not put troops on the ground, and they're still offshore in the skies. And the U.S. has repeatedly, whether it's the port that the military is building to facilitate humanitarian aid, that there no troops will set foot on Israel. I think there's a distinction there, and that's probably one that Israel is conscious of.
Well, so we've been talking for almost a half an hour, and these conversations, which have been about, they've always been about the war in Gaza until this week. So let me ask you first, Robin, which is, what does any of this have to do with the war in Gaza? What's its impact on the war in Gaza, if any?
Well, in many ways, the tensions between Israel and Iran are the same as the challenge in Israel dealing with Gaza, only writ large, region-wide. Again, I go back to, this is very hard because Israel doesn't have a long-term strategy in Gaza, and I don't think it has a long-term strategy on Iran either. And I think this is one of the conundrums from the United States. What does it do to try to bring either one to an end, to try to get back to a point where Israel can broker a deal for recognition with Saudi Arabia and change the face of the region and the conflict that has now endured for 76 years.
Aaron, how would you say this relates to the war in Gaza?
Well, I think another strategic cul-de-sac and no way out. The Biden administration was counting on pulling one lever, off and on negotiations between Israel and Hamas over the freedom for hostages in exchange for an asymmetrical trade of Palestinian prisoners, 6 weeks, calm, surging humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Now I think that's going to be even more difficult. Hamas, I think, will wait, because one of the triggers or the hopes of October 7 was to create regional chaos and confrontation. They'll wait to see how this plays out. I think Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, with the exception of one brigade, 5,000 guys, from 70, 80,000. The ground war in Gaza has essentially ended, even though the Israelis sent tanks into northern Gaza again. And borrowing a line from David Petraeus, who admits that the Israelis cannot pursue the same strategy in Gaza that we pursued in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was to clear, hold, and build. The Israelis clear, but remaining Hamas fighters fill in. And they can't build because, as Robin aptly noted, there is no political strategy for governance post-conflict. And I think Hamas now sees humanitarian assistance increasing. They've opened up, you've seen the first deliveries now from Ashdod into northern Gaza, flour deliveries. Bakeries are open in northern Gaza. We're far from where we need to be on the humanitarian side, but Hamas has no incentive whatsoever now to trade. And there's not much urgency on the part of the Israeli government either, because it's going to involve an asymmetrical trade of hundreds. I think the working number was 700 to 900 Palestinian prisoners, 100 of whom were either accused of or convicted of killing Israelis, including Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 5 lifetime sentences in an Israeli prison for killing 4 Israelis and a Greek national. I think here that, if you ask me, Robert, how this is going to end,
mm-hmm.
I wouldn't insult your intelligence by basically answering that question, because I don't know, Hamas doesn't know, Israel doesn't know, and we don't know. We're drifting, and right now I don't see any way out.
I wanted to hear from you about what Robin's been saying, because about the fact that Israel seems to lack any kind of long-term strategy for dealing with Iran. To me, this is like boilerplate for discussions of conflict in the Middle East. And I wonder if you can answer this. It seems to me quite often that Israel, a country with a rather short lifespan as a modern state, and very often led by generals, is brilliantly tactical and quite often doesn't seem to articulate a long-term strategy unless you're on the far right of the country and your strategy is to bully the other parties into settling the whole of the West Bank. Is there a skill there about thinking strategically that is underappreciated in Israel?
Well, I mean, I think that's true. And I think we've grown used to 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He's thinking very short term. He knows if he loses power, he faces two possibilities. Number one, after 3 years, he may be convicted. And if he wants to avoid a conviction and prison time, he'll have to negotiate a plea deal, which will mean his exit from politics. Look, the last Israeli prime minister, Ehud Barak, did think strategically at Camp David. You don't have to go into why that didn't work. The last Israeli prime minister who had a strategy was the late Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin's notion was you must deal with the inner problem in order to preempt and contain the outer problem. The inner problem was settling up with the Palestinians. The outer problem was Iran. He recognized it. And Islamic extremism. He did not live to see the implications and the threats and the growing power of the jihadis and the Islamic Republic. But he had a strategy.
Yeah.
And it's always been my contention, there are no rewind buttons on history, that if Rabin was not murdered, and again, before I say what I'm going to say, I voted for Republicans and Democrats and I worked for them. Had Bush 41 and James Baker gotten another 4 years, and Rabin had lived, we would have had one agreement, either between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Syria. And the conversation that we would be having now would be quite different. Rabin had a strategy, and he was killed for it.
Robin, right? I mean, Yitzhak Rabin was 30 years ago that where Aaron puts the last prime minister who had a strategy. Are the Israelis just short in that department?
Well, I remember going up to the Golan Heights with the IDF, and they were pointing out Elephant Hill and the various places that the Iranians had done reconnaissance missions, or where the son of the leader of Hezbollah had deployed with some of his Iranian, some of the military officials from Tehran. And you know, I'm always struck by how effective Israel can be in whether it's using its air power, its intelligence, not always perfect, but it does a very good job of identifying, finding operations that are undermining it. If anyone hasn't seen the series Tehran, it's a brilliant, done from the point of view of it's part in English, part in Hebrew, and part in Farsi, and it's brilliantly captured the kind of covert operations that happen between the two countries, something we don't see and something we don't talk about enough. But I do think that an Israeli general said to me, acknowledged, look, we know how to take some of these people out. What we don't know how to do is kind of the long term of preventing them from being there in the first place.
Yeah. Of course, the U.S., as you pointed out, the U.S. does not have troops on the ground. The troops on the ground in the region from the U.S. were there for the war in Iraq. And I was just curious, over this most recent exchange between Israel and Iran, where was Iraq? What role did the Iraqis play in this?
I spent 2 hours with the Iraqi prime minister on Tuesday evening, and he's in the middle of renegotiating the arrangement between the United States and Iraq in countering ISIS, which has gone on now for a decade. And Iraq is trying to distance itself. It wants to redefine the relationship, abandon the coalition that the United States organized, and engage in bilateral relationships, which mean that some U.S. forces are likely to come home. There was a missile shot down over Erbil. The Iraqis deny that. It was not apparently shot down by the Iraqis. It was shot down by a U.S. Patriot Patriot system. But Iraq just doesn't want to get involved in this. It has the awkward position of being a neighbor of Iran, relying on Iran for electricity, and at the same time having relied for more than a decade, or 21 years, if you want to look at it that way, on U.S. security, and it wants to go its own way increasingly. But on your point about U.S. forces, actually, we have more than 10,000, it could be well over 15,000 on the ground in the Middle East. We have 900 in Syria who've been very vulnerable. We have 2,500 in Iraq. We have several thousand who are trainers, including in Lebanon. I went with the head of CENTCOM into places like the Bekaa Valley and along the southern border with Israel. We have, our largest military base in the region is in Qatar. The United States has deployed 2 carrier battle groups, and
Bahrain.
we have a naval base in Bahrain. But since October 7th, we've deployed 2 carrier battle groups that have more than 7,000 forces on them. So we have a significant presence. My one concern long-term is that the more we deploy in the region, the more targets we're creating. I lived in Lebanon during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and watched as U.S. Marine peacekeepers came out to divide the Palestinians and the Israelis. And they ended up being targets because they were kind of sucked in, not intentionally. And the U.S. suffered the loss of 241 Marines, which was the largest loss of U.S. military life in a single incident since Iwo Jima in World War II.
Yes, this was when the U.S. was there in a peacekeeping role in Beirut. Aaron, I'm curious about what you think of other regional players. That is, is Turkey a significant influence on anyone as this conflict comes out of the shadows and escalates? We talk about the Saudis. Are the Saudis unofficially but actively engaged in the same defense system as Israel? Who's on whose team here?
If you looked at the region, you see at least 5 Arab states in active phases of dysfunction: Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Syria. As I look at the region, if there were a way, and there's not, the real powers in this region are the 3 non-Arabs: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. They all have the power, the military and intelligence power, to project their influence beyond their borders in a significant way, which no other Arab state has. One's a member of NATO. One is America's closest ally, still. One is a pariah, at least from the standpoint of the United States. But I guess my point is that we're going to be dealing in the years ahead with a highly dysfunctional Arab world. Right now, the focus of activity for this administration has shifted to the Gulf for obvious reason: Arab hydrocarbons, the Abraham Accords, Chinese inroads, at least economic inroads, and what I call the hope and aspiration of the Biden administration still to this very day, in spite of everything that's happened. They are still hopeful. Maybe should Biden get a second term. They've worked out bilateral arrangements with Saudi Arabia that I never believed we would see. A mutual defense pact, short of an Article 5 commitment. Do you know the last time, Robert, we concluded a mutual defense treaty? Oh, by the way, and they want Senate ratification of that treaty. The last time we concluded a mutual defense treaty with any country was the revision of the 1960 U.S.-Japan treaty. Number 2, they want to export U.S. technology, and the Saudis want to control their own fuel cycle. They're working on some creative fix that won't violate our proliferation policy. So the administration has put enormous currency on the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. And last point, Mohammed bin Salman is AKMBS, is 38 years old. He will govern Saudi.
The crown prince we're talking about.
Yeah, the putative king of Saudi Arabia. All right. He will govern Saudi Arabia, assuming he becomes king, for more than 50 years. He will see 6 or 7 American presidents come and go. And I think we have to be extremely sober in terms of how dependent and reliant we want to become on what is now the most oppressive Arab state in the region.
Saudi.
Yeah, in terms of its own control mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Syria, obviously, as well, but then Assad doesn't control the entire country.
Robin, I don't know how to, well, I guess this is how I'd put this. At one time, we would have been really smart back in the late 80s or early 90s to say, boy, in that part of the world, Islamism or political Islam is gaining ground, and it's building on the failures of other ideologies and the promise that it offers and the connection people feel with it, feel with their religion. Is there any idea out there, that is there any new idea that you find popular or moving in Middle Eastern countries that you that you go to, or where you talk to people who've come from those countries? Anything budging, or is it still Islamism versus some vague authoritarianism?
Look, we were all inspired by the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, but that rippled across the region, Syria, Bahrain, many places. The challenge was at the time that this was a predominantly young movement that had no real platform, no network, no resources, wasn't a sophisticated polity. They knew what they were against, but not what they were for, and couldn't create an alternative. And many throughout the region before that had clung to Islam because it was something that offered a set of values. Remember, it's the only religion in the world that offers a set of rules by which to govern a state, as well as ideas of faith to believe in. And so it was a natural for from the 1973 war onwards to be an alternative to the authoritarian rule that predominated across the region, and which, it should be noted, the United States supported in many places. We wanted to have, it was easier to deal with one autocrat than to deal with, the complications of democratic governments in many. And so we supported the likes of President Mubarak in Egypt. And so, we've seen turning points in the evolution of political Islam. And we all hope that as the Islamic State imploded in 2019, that we had gotten through the worst of it. And that across the region, the militants in the region had been ousted or imprisoned or marginalized or defeated militarily. The danger today is that even in places like Jordan, where you find educated pro-Western, or largely, pro-Western government and society, that I've been told by my Jordanian colleagues and contacts that people don't like Hamas for its ideology. They abhor its tactics, but they look at Hamas as the one place, one entity that has resisted Israel. And the danger is that we see some kind of revival of Islamism in a different form, in a way that we've never been able to anticipate the various waves of it. And does this, impact what happens next region-wide? I know that the United States said to some Israeli officials, look, don't go into Lebanon, don't level the place, because it will become the new frontier for recruiting every jihadi around the world. And so I think Israel needs to be smart about what it does down the road so that it doesn't win the battle but lose the war.
Robin Wright and Aaron David Miller, as we've been speaking, I believe people have been sending in questions, and Suzanne Borden has been looking at them. So, Suzanne, what are people interested in?
Yes, first, thank you all for that very important conversation. So the first question is, why did Jordan get involved in shooting down some of these drones?
Robin, do you want to answer that one?
I defer to Aaron on this one.
Okay.
I think Jordan's an ally, but Aaron, I defer to you.
No, I think the Jordanians rationalized in the public statements they made that Jordan has to protect its own citizenry. And the Jordanian-Iranian relationship is not a terribly close one. I think King Abdullah basically calculated that at a minimum cost, and there's a lot of Jordanian upset with respect to the war in Gaza. We have to remember that it's the longest border that Israel has with any country, and it's also the most permeable. At the same time, I think King Abdullah rationalized this was an easy one. I mean, he's going to shoot down Iranian drones transgressing his airspace, pilotless drones, and picking up some points with the Americans for sure. Very frosty relationship, unfortunately, sadly, with the current Israeli government. So I think this was an easy one for the Jordanians, although there may be domestic political blowback. We'll see, to Robin's point, whether or not the Israelis respond, and how that response is going to be greeted in the Arab world.
Suzanne?
Thank you. If the Israelis do not exchange Palestinian prisoners for hostages, how else will the hostages be freed?
I fear they won't. I think it's going to require a deal. With the last time Hamas held a prisoner, Israel had to release more than 1,000 Palestinians. And the only real asset that Hamas has today are those Israeli lives. And it will play every single one of them for something it wants. And that's the tragedy and the travesty.
Yeah, I'm afraid Robin's right. 136 hostages, 31 the Israelis think are already gone, either killed on October 7, their bodies brought to Gaza to trade, or died in captivity. Hamas now claims they can only identify 20. They were supposed to do 40 in the latest deal. Hamas does not control them all. They clearly know who has them. Women in particular. I don't like talking publicly about this, in large part because of the families. But this is an exceedingly grim situation. And it serves as a radicalizing force in domestic Israeli politics. One of the reasons that the current Israeli government was under no pressure to do anything on the humanitarian side, there would not have been one iota of Israeli facilitated aid into Gaza in the last 6 months had it not been for pressure from the administration. The Israelis could have opened up Ashdod. It's got all the screening facilities. It's 20 miles north of Gaza. But the Israeli public, the families of the hostages demonstrating during one visit, the visit was canceled by the Secretary of State because of the white hot anger. You hold our people, you abuse our wives and our daughters, and we're not going to do anything for the population of Gaza.
This was a protest against the delivery of food and medicine.
And it's only under great, enormous pressure. And the threat, the closest the administration has come to threatening to use its leverage is the threat to use leverage if Mr. Netanyahu did not help facilitate and accelerate humanitarian assistance into Gaza. That's the test Joe Biden gave to the prime minister. He seems to be passing it, more or less.
Suzanne?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, yeah. How concerned should we be that there are people in the United States that are now cheering for Iran in addition to Hamas, some waving Hezbollah flags and chanting death to America Is it something that should be ignored, or is this something we should take note of?
That's a question better directed to the FBI and Homeland Security. But it just one broader point. I have never in my years here, in government or out, seen any Middle Eastern issue, not even the deployment of American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were losing American men and women, and we were killing thousands of Afghans and Iraqis. I've never seen any issue, royal domestic politics, as the Israel-Hamas war has done. I don't know why. I think there are many different explanations. Some I think would probably take you to a dark place. But I think we live in an argue culture. Maybe that's part of it. But it is, to me, profoundly upsetting and disturbing that it has driven people to their respective corners in a way no other Middle Eastern issue has. I wasn't in government during Vietnam. I was at the University of Michigan, Go Blue. Robin and I were both there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was plenty of upset during the late 60s, early 70s over Vietnam, but not since Vietnam. Protests demonstrate, the police today, the New York Times reported, arrested protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters at Columbia. I'm not sure it was the university police. It might have been the New York City police. So this is increasingly fraught. And off the point of the question, I'm sorry, but this is an American issue. And who knows, it could cost the president his presidency.
Robin, did you have thoughts about this? It is very unusual. The criticism of Israel or opposition to Israel is far less surprising to me than the in some quarters, student protesters, the embrace of Hamas, which seems to be a tough outfit to love. I'm curious what you think.
I really don't want to touch this one. I will
All right,
only. I think that some of those, who knows what percentage, may be sympathetic to the loss of Palestinian civilian life. It may not be support for Hamas. I think there's, again, there's a diversity of, I think, views about what's happening. But I cover foreign wars, not American wars.
Fair enough. Suzanne?
So then the next question is going to be for Aaron. Today, 13 Democratic House members voted against a resolution condemning Iran's attack on Israel. If you had a crystal ball, what might support of Israel by the United States look like in 10 or 20 years from now?
I argue with people I respect and some who I have less respect for about the headlines and the trend lines for the U.S.-Israel relationship. My own view, and it runs against some of the current, I'm of a split mind here. Never, again, in my experience, have the two drivers that have cemented the U.S.-Israeli relationship these many years been more under stress and more fraught. That is to say, the perception that the U.S. and Israel share common values, and number two, the high coincidence of interests that we over the years have shared with the Israelis. I think both of these drivers are increasingly fraught. At the same time, what I call the operating system of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, after 6 months of war in Gaza, you needed a test, at least from the executive branch, as the sustainability or the reluctance to use pressure, serious pressure against Israel. That operating system still exists. So 10 or 20 years, I'm 75 years old. It's the question for my kids. I think there will be a course corrective in Israel. I do believe that. Back to a center-right government that's more pragmatic, that believes in the independence of the Israeli judiciary, that believes in more civil dialogue within Israel, but very withholding. I think Robin's right. Robin's right, and she's right. Not just on the issue of Iran, but very withholding also on the issue of what to do about the much too promised land with the Palestinians. I don't think we're on the verge of what I call the big cosmic oy vey in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. But the trend lines to me are not terribly uplifting given the generational changes that have occurred.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, somebody said everyone's criticizing Netanyahu for not having a long-term plan. What are some possible long-term ideas that could be put forth?
Go for it, Aaron.
Robin, you sure don't want to take us out?
Yep.
Sure, 100% sure.
Absolutely.
Look, in a galaxy far, far away, rather than back here on planet Earth in a government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, you might be able to see a much more strategic view on the part of a different Israeli prime minister and the security establishment over how to empower rather than disempower the Palestinian Authority. You wouldn't see an active effort to annex the West Bank in everything but name only. You wouldn't see an environment in which settlers are encouraged to rampage against Palestinians. You might even see a degree of cooperation with the United States on humanitarian assistance and on creating a different sort of reality for Gaza. But none of this right now is possible. And at the end of the day, it's all about leadership, not just on the Israeli side, but on the Palestinian side as well. And we don't have it.
Okay. Well, on that.
By the way, Suzanne, I just wanted to add that while I don't know what the vote count was exactly on the Hill, but while there may have been 13 Democrats voting or not voting with the majority of Democrats, there probably were a strong majority of Republicans also voting for that at that time. That is,
I think it said there was one Republican who did not vote.
Yeah. So in other words, there was a very strong majority in favor of condemning that attack.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, Robin, Aaron, Robert, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts about the situation. I want to thank everybody else for joining us and watching. I will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to this recording. And please go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for next week's program, which will be talking about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism specifically on campus with Dr. Sharon Nazarian. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll speak to you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So much. Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And